Hello friends, and welcome into another weekly update video for the week ending on July 11th. John, Jerry, we've got a lot to jump into this week. So let's talk about the IRS case. We've written an article about it. You can go, it's probably down below. If you're watching this on the email or on our website, you can see the link to that article. John, what do we need to know about this IRS case and the Johnson Amendment?
Well, it was really exciting and interesting. In a federal district court in the state of Texas, there was a lawsuit that was going on between various parties, including the IRS, and there was a challenge regarding the Johnson Amendment, which has been used to restrict the ability of churches to be involved in political activities, political speech, and those sorts of things. And the IRS actually entered into a consent agreement with the other parties in this lawsuit, presented this to the judge, and it was accepted by the judge. And it basically does away with a decades-long prohibition against churches' engagement in political speech that is referred to as the Johnson Amendment. This judgment states, I'm going to read a couple of quotes from it because I think it's really instructive and helpful for us to understand the scope of what we're talking about here. It says, quote, "For many houses of worship, the exercise of their religious beliefs includes teaching or instructing their congregations regarding all aspects of life, including guidance concerning the impact of faith on the choices inherent in electoral politics." And so basically, churches have a role in informing their congregations about political issues and also people that are running for political office. We go on to surmise from the reading this consent judgment that it's widely understood that through this action, the IRS is conceding that it will no longer seek to enforce the Johnson Amendment restrictions on churches, including involvement in political campaigns, endorsement of political candidates, and other engagement in political speech. And this is important as long as those communications are, quote, "from a house of worship to its congregation in connection with religious services through its usual channels of communication on matters of faith." Now that's a lot of words, but it basically says that a pastor, church leaders can speak about not only political issues, but also political candidates from the pulpit within the church. They can endorse candidates. They can do a lot of these what had been considered to be previously prohibited political speech and activities if they're doing it within the congregation or within the family. And the judgment actually speaks kind of in terms of communication that takes place within a family.
Right. A lot of people have described this as a clarification of the Johnson Amendment. There's been a lot of misinformation for many years about this, and not get too much in the history, but it applied to all nonprofits, including churches. We're a nonprofit, churches are nonprofits. What people had understood was you can talk about issues as much as you want. Really the only restriction was when it related to what they called political campaign activity for or against a candidate or a political party. That was understood to be a restriction for nonprofits. It's a consent judgment, all the parties to the case, IRS agreed with the others. Let's sit down and agree to what we want to say. And what they basically said was, in the case of churches, you are, just as you've described and read, John, from the opinion or that judgment, you're able not only to talk about issues, you can now talk about the candidates. And so this is hopefully going to clear up a whole lot of self-imposed restrictions that churches have placed on themselves. A lot of them wouldn't talk about issues because they're going, well, no, there's the Johnson Amendment. Well, it never did stop issues. And now we're hearing it not only opens the door for issue discussion, but candidate discussion. But as you say, John, within the church, within the communications, within the church.
And I think it's super exciting because we know as we seek to be salt and light in the culture, agents of effect in the culture, that not only where you stand on issues, but who you vote for, why you're making certain electoral choices. Those things are important. Those things are informed by our faith. And the IRS is basically saying it's appropriate that those things be informed by the church and the church leadership, and the congregants can, are free to hear this type of information, and it's going to free churches up to do a whole lot. Of course, NC Family produces a very valuable voter guide. Every election, we always make sure that the voter guide is compliant with C3 regulations and policies, but this is going to free up churches to be able to distribute voter guides and provide other information about candidates and elections without fear of losing their tax-exempt status.
And I would see this as a bigger part of what I think we're all encouraged about, the recognition of religious freedom and free speech and how those go together. And the government, and sometimes there's been so much confusion when there's clarification like this is a very positive step.
Let's go to the state, and there's a lot of action, not in the General Assembly building right now, but from the governor's desk. There have been some signatures and some vetoes. Let's work through a couple of those, a couple of bills that we've reported to you in the past. Let's start with S442, Senate Bill 442, the Parents Protection Act, and this helped parents parent their children from a basis of biological sex without fear of the government coming in and telling them that they could not do so, that they must affirm the asserted gender of their child or that minor. Tell us what we need to know about that, and of course, the governor has signed this bill into law.
Well, we have seen in some other states like California and Colorado proposals that have been put forth that would allow the government to come in and take children away from their parents if the parents refuse to affirm a child's gender dysphoria or gender confusion. And so based on that and just pure common sense, a number of legislators introduced this legislation in the General Assembly to clarify even further, as we've seen in the last several years, the fundamental rights of parents to raise their children as they deem most appropriate. And in this case, that it protects parents from being accused or potentially charged with abuse or neglect if they refuse to affirm a child's gender confusion. And so it's really as simple as that. The bill also includes a provision that says that a prospective adoptive parent cannot be denied having a child placed with them if they would refuse to affirm a child's gender confusion or the child's desire to go through with a gender transition, that sort of thing.
And again, I would say this is an example of a law being passed that is affirming, as you say, John,
Yes.
parental rights and religious freedom. I mean, for a lot of parents, this is a religious understanding that God creates us unique, male and female, in addition to the medical, social, scientific evidence that we're looking out for children's physical and mental health. This is encouraging. We see a court case, now we're seeing legislation affirming religious freedom, parental rights.
And the governor signed the bill into law, and so we're grateful for the legislature, for those who championed this bill through both chambers of the General Assembly, got it to the governor's desk, and then for the governor to sign this bill. Frankly, we were a bit surprised, but very grateful for that. And so this bill has been enacted into law in North Carolina.
One of the bills that made its way through the legislative process was House Bill 959, and that came across from the House to the Senate as a bill that promoted social media literacy and helping students understand the good and the bad of social media. That bill, once it got to the Senate, took on some new identity, and the governor has signed House Bill 959, which had some education changes in it, most significantly, once again, the social media aspect, but also mobile communication devices and public schools having a plan to address that during instructional time. The governor signed it, so thank you to the governor and also those members of the body, both senators and House members who moved that through. Anything that our viewers need to know about that bill that is now law?
Well, I think this is a good example of, there's almost unanimous support in the vote in the legislature, the governor, everybody realizing that a lot is happening or not happening with our young people as it relates to all this communication. And they realize you can't address the freedom once people are, they're at home or out. But when they're in school for hours out of the day, both sides were pointing to not only the educational effect, the positive effect that it will to not have these distractions, but also a lot of them talked about the mental, emotional, psychological impact that a lot of this is having on young people. And so it was very encouraging to hear how people can come together, look at the facts, look at the truth, and agree we need to take positive steps to try to address this situation.
Yep.
So let's get
Good
to a
bill.
couple of his vetoes, and we'll talk about a little bit at the end of these two bills what the process moving forward is now for the legislature and the governor. Governor Stein vetoed SB or S227, which we know is DEI in public schools, not in colleges and universities, in public colleges and universities, but in lower public schools where children are educated. That bill has been vetoed, and so what do we need to know about that bill and its path moving forward?
Well, this bill is designed to prohibit public schools from engaging in what is referred to in the bill as discriminatory practices or providing instruction on divisive concepts, such as the notion that one race or sex is inherently superior or inferior to another race or sex, or that an individual is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive solely by virtue of his race or sex. The bill outlines a variety of things, but that's kind of the crux of what these divisive concepts and discriminatory practices are founded upon. So the bill would prohibit instruction and indoctrination into those ideas in public school. And so, yes, the governor did veto this. He also vetoed similar bills that would restrict the government, by and large, from adopting these DEI principles, and also DEI in higher education. This is the one that we really focused on, was Senate Bill 227.
This one, quite honestly, is a mystery to me because I would have hoped that the same outcome would have happened with this legislation as happened with the mobile devices. Because when you listen to the debate, and John, just as you cited those examples of how terms diversity, equity, and inclusion, when rightly applied, are positive things. But unfortunately, in a number of schools, in certain curriculum, that's not happening. And this bill is trying to address it. Unfortunately, this became a partisan issue. And so the vote was pretty much, definitely, I think 100% along party lines. And that's unfortunate. But that's part of the reality of how it works. You hope that everybody's listening to the debate. And I know we can all go in with preconceived notions. And unfortunately, that's what seemed to rule the day on this particular.
There were several senators that championed this and got it across the finish line, at least to the governor's desk. And we'll talk about what that process looks like here in just a second after the veto. Last bill we'll cover today, it has also been vetoed, and that is House Bill 805, HB 805, easy for some to say, not this guy. It's a multifaceted pro-family bill. It started as a bill to protect the images of everyone, but specifically women and children online, specifically pornographic images. Let's talk about what happened to that bill and the lack of the signature from the governor and his veto.
Well, yeah, as you said, it did start out in the House as a bill that would protect, especially women and children, from sexual exploitation online, from having their images posted online without their consent and some other requirements. The bill went to the Senate, and they added a number of provisions to it. One, and important and valuable provisions, one that would define male and female in state law based on biological sex. Also, that would prohibit tax dollars from being used to fund gender transition activities of individuals in our state prisons. It would also had a couple of provisions that would reinforce parental rights as it relates to public education. So the Senate added a number of great provisions to this bill, and the House and Senate were able to come to agreement on it. They sent the bill to the governor, and of course, as Mitch has said, the governor vetoed that bill and sent it back to the General Assembly.
So now what? For these two bills and others, S227, H805, that the governor has vetoed them, what is the course of action now for those two bills?
herding cats, I would say.
We don't know exactly what the course of action is. We do
Yeah.
know the path, at least, for those.
Well, when a bill gets vetoed by the governor, it goes back to the General Assembly. If it's a Senate bill, it goes back first to the Senate. If it's a House bill, it goes back first to the House for the consideration of that chamber to see if they can muster the votes, the 3/5 votes necessary to override the governor's veto. So that requires 30 votes out of the 50 votes in the Senate. Republicans actually have just 30 votes in the Senate. So as a block, if everybody's there and the Senate Republicans are all voting together, they can override the governor's veto. In the House, it's a little bit of a different story. Republicans hold the majority, but they're one seat short of a veto-proof supermajority. And so they either have to entice, encourage a Democrat or more than one Democrat to come over and vote with the Republicans to override the veto, or if there are certain members, a certain percentage or number of members who are not there and voting, it's possible that the number that's required to override the veto can change a bit. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that works. In the House, it is going to be a bit more difficult, and so I think every day they come back into session and are considering override votes, the House leadership is going to want to know exactly how many members are going to be there, what the vote count looks like, and whether it's feasible for them to actually override the governor's veto or not.
So kids, if you're watching and listening right now, fractions are really important.
Yeah.
Listen to your math teacher.
Well, and it's also another important lesson, and we don't know what'll happen. There was in the House one Democrat who voted for this bill on
Yes.
this vote.
Yes.
There are a lot of dynamics. There's going to be a lot of pressure, I'm sure, applied to that individual as the veto vote is approached. The other thing that's interesting about this, just a side note, I know we talked about unanimous support, partisan support. This bill started out with unanimous support pretty much when it was addressing pornography.
805.
Yes, the last one we discussed. But as you mentioned, John, some other aspects were added to the bill, and now, unfortunately, it's pretty much divided along party lines. This is just what's interesting about the process, but it's also why we appreciate your working together with us, because part of what can happen with members is instead of the pressures that are there in the legislature being the main voice, when they hear from you back home that, hey, I hear this is a good bill that is very much a pro-family bill, I want to encourage you to support it. It makes a difference.
Speaking of that action,
Yes.
you can go to our action alert page. It's probably linked at the bottom of this video as well. And you can reach out to your senator and your House member and let them know to support good pro-family legislation, just like the two bills that we've just mentioned.
And we do have action alerts on the Action Center,
Correct.
specifically on these bills, and a very easy way for you to reach out to both your member in the House and the Senate to express your interest in them overriding the governor's veto of both of these bills.
John, one more story that we've been tracking for some time. It's been a very long process, and there's been a lot to be said on children, well, all people for that matter, but specifically children and gender-affirming care. We're not going to give you all the details on this one today because it's still developing. But John, tell us what we need to know about the HHS report and the Federal Trade Commission.
Well, back in May, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services put out a big report
Hundreds of
on
pages.
the issues of gender-affirming care, so-called gender-affirming care, gender transitions, a lot of the controversy, a lot of the factual untruths that have been put out there by many in the medical field and in other fields, basically saying that they're pushing a political agenda versus true science and medicine. And just this week on Wednesday, and I find this really fascinating, the United States Federal Trade Commission held a workshop, a full-day workshop up in D.C., to raise alarm about gender-affirming care. It was called The Dangers of Gender-Affirming Care for Minors. And the stated purpose of the workshop was to examine, quote, whether consumers are being or have been exposed to false or unsupportive claims about gender-affirming care and potential harms consumers may be experiencing as a result, both minors and their families. Interestingly, the Federal Trade Commission is particularly interested in looking at this from the standpoint of whether this gender affirming cares and doctors and others that are engaging in it and promoting it are engaging in unfair and deceptive trade practices. That's kind of the wheelhouse of what the FTC looks at. And so for them to basically host a full-day workshop on this, the chairman of the FTC made some really, really strong and I think impressive remarks about concerns about gender-affirming care. This is just another effort within the Trump administration, Department of Health and Human Services, Federal Trade Commission, and we're seeing other agencies and departments come out making statements about this, adopting policies that affirm a biblical sexual ethic. And that's what we, of course, agree with. And so it's exciting to see, not only the kind of turn of events on a lot of these gender issues that have been happening in Europe, where a lot more information is coming to light, and physicians, those in the medical practice, are coming out and saying, hold on, we've gone way too far with this, and now they're stepping things back. We're starting to see that substantively happen in the United States, and so it's really exciting. And again, I would just say for the Federal Trade Commission to come out and host an entire day workshop on this issue, expressing these concerns very clearly and providing a basis for citizens in our country to provide feedback and to craft policies as a result of that, that is very, very important, and we're excited to see it.
Just to mention, as I'm hearing you describe that, John, this is when the government is great, when they're looking at, and what government's generally going to look at, medical, social, scientific evidence. But as we know, if you find the facts, the truth, it's going to line up with God's ways.
Yeah.
And this is what we all want, is what's best for people's lives and for these children who are struggling. People need to be there in the right way for them, to walk with them in this, and not to take them down, like you say, wrongful, deceptive paths. So this is encouraging.
Just one more thing I want to read on this. So the chairman of the Federal Trade Commission was speaking, and he basically said in his remarks, as chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, Congress has entrusted me with protecting citizens from deceptive acts and practices, and one of the reasons we're here today is to examine whether some of the practices in gender-affirming care are deceptive and require greater scrutiny by the FTC. And so a big statement by Andrew Ferguson, the chairman of the FTC, and we'll see where this goes. Certainly stay tuned. We'll be reporting on this and developments in this area from other agencies. But again, I think fascinating and particularly exciting.
Certainly some encouraging news from D.C. on this particular
Yeah.
issue. Speaking of encouraging news, CNBC has said that North Carolina, yet again, is the #1 state to do business. And on that note, we're so grateful for all that you do to support our organization here at NC Family. For our staff, John, Jerry, Mitch, and the rest of our team here at NC Family, thank you once again for watching another one of our weekly update videos. God bless each and every one of you.
Thank you.